Hello, everyone. I want to talk about CO2, but in the build-up to CO2, I want us just to look back in time and have a quick look at what we did, both in terms of public health and as a broader sort of global community, to tackle other things, in particular lead in petrol, CFCs in the atmosphere, and tobacco smoke. And we'll start with lead. We knew way back in 370 BC, Hippocrates identified lead as a neurotoxin. So we've known that lead is bad for us for a long, long time. And what we found is, if you click on the button, what you find is, now, I'm going to be putting up these timetables. Don't worry about all the boxes. We're not going to have time to get into all of them. So what I'll do is I'll try and draw your attention to the more interesting stuff. In general, what you're going to see in each of the timelines is we see these phases as we go along, and there's an early awareness of the science, and then there's a denial from industry and a push back to discredit the science. We see a lot of push for voluntary measures, industry standards, instead of regulation and legislation. We then see some regulatory wins where countries start to put in place legislation to address problems. And then ultimately, we see victory when there's global cooperation and we have international treaties which are legally binding and everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya. So let's have a look. Now, as I said, we're not going to get into all of these boxes, but the interesting stuff here is in 1921, Thomas Midgley, a scientist working for General Motors, discovers that lead can stop engine knock. And then working with General Motors and DuPont and other sort of industry leaders, they commercialize this and lead gets into petrol all over the place. Within 3 years, so 3 years later, 17 people die at DuPont and Standard Oil. So DuPont knows categorically that these people died of lead. Thomas Midgley himself gets severe lead poisoning, but nevertheless, Thomas and GM and DuPont go around commercializing this, claiming it to be safe, pushing back against any science that says otherwise, and opting for regulations to be foregone, instead pushing for industry standards. 2002, we've got the UNEP partnerships for clean fuel and vehicles. And then by 2021, we've actually got lead out of the petrol. But interestingly, that took 100 years. So from the point that we knew there was a problem and understood that there was a problem, it took 100 years to get the stuff out of petrol. And let's have a look then, if we move on to CFCs. And CFCs, again, we know that they cause ozone depletion, and ozone is important to protect us from UV rays. What's interesting about the CFC discussion is that you see the same personalities emerge. So 1928, Thomas Midgley, the same Thomas Midgley, invents CFC 12, which then General Motors and DuPont, the same GM and DuPont that we've just talked about with respect to lead, commercialize Freon, which is basically CFC 12, and get it everywhere. We very quickly learn and begin to discover that CFCs deplete ozone. We then discover that there's an actual hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica, and it takes until about 1987 for us to get the Montreal Protocol in place, which is a legally binding international treaty to phase out CFCs. And by 2010, we've got CFCs out of the way. So between really identifying that CFCs are a real problem and getting them completely eliminated took us 70 years in the case of CFCs. I'm going quite quickly because I really want to get to CO2. That's the sort of thing that we want to focus on here. But interesting lessons from tobacco. Now, obviously, we know that tobacco is not good for you, but we really only understood that in 1950. So Hill and Dole did a fantastic piece of research demonstrating that tobacco smoke caused cancer and cardiovascular disease. What we did find, what's interesting about what happened then is that the tobacco industry employ a PR firm called Hill and Knowlton. And they create, you can see there, it's called the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. That quickly had its name changed, because this was basically put together by Hill and Knowlton. And that became known as the Council for Tobacco Research. The reason for the name change is this. They wanted the Council for Tobacco Research to be seen as this independent voice, this reasonable voice that's speaking on behalf of science, not to be seen as an industry-funded propaganda machine that it actually was. So despite overwhelming evidence coming from Hill and Dole and other science that emerged that showed that tobacco causes cancer and cardiovascular disease, the Council for Tobacco Research did this, what we call the frank statement, saying, smoking is safe, it's all about personal choice, and really what we need is more research. In other words, saying, basically, we're not sure. But we were sure, but there was this seemingly independent, rational voice was saying, we're not sure, scientists really don't know. Now, British American Tobacco lost a lawsuit in the 1990s, and because of that lawsuit, they were forced to make their internal documents publicly available. And by looking at those internal documents, we know categorically that they knew categorically that tobacco was causing harm and had a deliberate campaign of disinformation, and basically lied to the public, and still do try to kind of make the fact of tobacco causing cancer a controversial issue, surprisingly, despite the masses of science that supports the opposite. Now, with respect to tobacco, we get to 2003, and we have the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. This was led by a fellow by the name of Derek Yak. I know him well. I think the FCTC was a fantastic public health intervention, saved millions of lives. There was a problem, however, and I know Derek well, and I've said this to him. The problem with the FCTC is that it focused exclusively on addressing demand for tobacco. So there was advertising bans, warnings on packets, excise tax to push the prices up. All of this was aimed at decreasing demand for tobacco. Nothing was done to address supply. In other words, the tobacco industry was basically left alone. You do and produce whatever you want. What we're going to do is try and get people to smoke less, which was effective to a point. So how effective was it? Well, there's still today about 8 million people every year that die from tobacco smoke. So just to give that number a little bit of context, that's 23,000 people a day. That's every hour the equivalent of a large passenger jet crashing, every hour, day and night, every day, and getting worse. If we were to develop a new drug, let's say I invented something called paracetamol, and I said, look, this drug is fine, you don't need to worry about it. If we limit the use as much as we can, it'll probably only kill 23,000 people a day. We would never allow a product like that on the market today. Like, we just wouldn't. And yet somehow we're perfectly fine with the tobacco industry selling something that we know kills 8 million people a year, and our focus is still entirely on trying to address the demand for tobacco. And as you can imagine, there's a lesson there. So if we fast forward and start talking about CO2, I'm not going to get into the weeds on the extent to which climate change affects health, because obviously there's a lot of people talking about that today, but just sort of very briefly in summary, we know that it impacts on the infectious disease footprint. We know that it causes heat stress, which has health consequences, catastrophic weather events, starvation, displacement of people, and ultimately potentially conflict, which itself then will translate into a lot of human suffering and death. Arguably, it represents an existential threat to humanity. So the timeline of CO2, and what's not on this timeline because it goes back a little bit far, but in 1859, a fellow by the name of John Tyndall shows that CO2 traps heat. So all the way back in the 1850s, we knew that CO2 was trapping heat. About 99 years later, so in 1958, Charles Keeling starts this continuous monitoring of CO2, and we get what's called the Keeling curve. And he shows definitively that this increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is connected to fossil fuel burning. So the science around global warming and the greenhouse effect and climate change becomes very apparent all the way back in the 1950s. Now, the fossil fuel industry were not only so impressed by the tobacco industry's efforts to push back against the science and discredit the science, and to push back against regulation by going with industry standards instead. Not only were they impressed with that strategy, but they employed the exact same PR firm to do it. So the tobacco industry employed Hill and Knowlton to create the Tobacco Research Council, and the fossil fuel industry creates, I can't remember the name of the thing that they create. Sorry, going back and forth. I can't go back up and down on the slide, sorry. I can't scroll, so I can't see what I'd written for that. But there we go. Anyway, don't worry. The fossil fuel industry do basically the same thing. They create an industry front, which basically says, look, you don't have to worry about the science. It's all unclear. It's still controversial. We still see that today. We see the US president saying, oh, it's a big hoax, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. So just keeping it controversial, make sure that people can use that as an excuse, was absolutely the strategy. In 1992, we have the Rio Earth Summit, and at that point, we create the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, the Convention on Climate Change. Following the creation of that, we have these COP meetings. So we've got the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, and then we've got the 2000, and a number of them, but then the 2015 Paris Agreement. The problem with these agreements is that they're very difficult to enforce. In other words, countries can simply opt out if they want to. And we saw that with Kyoto. We saw Canada just pulled out. The United States signed the treaty, but then didn't ratify it nationally. With the Paris Agreement, the US pulled out. So you've got these treaties that are just not enforceable. And I think the thing that we just have to kind of accept is that the way we're addressing climate change simply isn't working. So CO2 emissions last year were at a record high. Temperature last year was at a record high. Both CO2 emissions and temperature are increasing. So if we really think that this is the sort of crisis that we believe it is, we need to perhaps take more radical and drastic action to address it. These soft treaties that allow countries just to pull out as and when they want to at their own convenience do not seem to be working. We've known about the science for nearly 100 years. We've had 30 years of these COP agreements, and still CO2 emissions going up, still temperatures are going up. So perhaps we need to be thinking about this in a slightly different way. I have a couple of suggestions to put on the table. You may agree or disagree with them, but I think we're at a point in this conversation where putting things on the table is not a bad idea. The first is that there's climate damage liability. And this would make fossil fuel companies retroactively liable for climate damage. Now, in actual fact, not only is this possible, but it is already being done. It's just not being done everywhere. And I would argue for a wider spread adoption of this kind of policy to really put the fossil fuel industry under pressure and put them under pressure in the way that they understand, which is financially. The second is for climate emergency constitutions. This is something that individual countries can do. They can constitutionally enshrine the rights of future generations. Make climate stability a constitutional requirement, and this would enable courts to overturn legislation that threaten climate targets. And the final one is fossil fuel non-proliferation treaties, similar to the nuclear weapons treaties. And to do this, really, the underlying principle here would be, if you take fossil fuels out of the ground, you're going to put them in the air. So you need to stop mining for fossil fuels. And I know that that'll take time to get in place, but what you need to be doing is you need to be saying you need an international treaty for which, if there is contravention of that treaty, there are economic sanctions from the rest of the group against that country. You know, the only time that we've really seen successful international treaties where countries may have an economic incentive not to abide by them was the World Trade Organization's multilateral trade agreements, which allowed for all signatory countries to put economic sanctions on countries that didn't abide by them. And that was tremendously successful, and well, basically until now, because Donald Trump seems to have blown that out the water, but it has been a very successful system for at least 25 years. And I think with respect to climate change, given the seriousness of it, that's the kind of approach that we should be advocating for. Thank you for your time.